Today we're going to shift gears away from the Cold War in Europe and talk a little bit about the early events of the Cold War in Asia, specifically the events of the Korean War. The Korean War was really the first test outside of Europe of that new Truman Doctrine that we talked a little bit about last week, that new American foreign policy of containment, which was preventing the further spread of communism by supporting any country that was threatened directly by communism, by an uprising or an invasion. The Korean War is one that I feel often gets overlooked, at least here in America. Um, it definitely occupies a much lower place in the collective conscience of the country compared to uh, the two wars that it's sandwiched between World War II, which was obviously a far more massive and widespread war, and Vietnam, which became so contentious, and all the issues that obviously went with that we may or may not talk about later. But again, today we're going to talk about the Korean War, very important war, obviously led directly to the ongoing situation in Korea, which we hear about so much on the news. It seems like it's frequently popping up every few months or so. So let's set the stage a little bit by talking about the aftermath of World War II. In the closing days of that war, once the war in Europe had been won and Germany defeated, and focus turned towards the final few battles against Japan, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and quickly overran Japanese controlled Manchuria and the northern part of the Korean peninsula. The result of that was that when the war finally did end, all of the Japanese troops north of the 38th parallel, that's 38 degrees north latitude, surrendered to Soviet forces, while all those south of that line surrendered to American and Allied forces. And the result of that was that competing zones of occupation developed, pretty much exactly like we talked about in Germany. And that would later happen in Vietnam, if you know anything about that. So again, we had in the north a Soviet zone of occupation, and in the south an American zone of occupation. In their zone of occupation and control in the north, the Soviet Union established a communist government known by the somewhat counterintuitive name of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I say that's counterintuitive because obviously there was nothing democratic about it. It was put in place by the Soviets without any real consultation with the Korean people who were living there whatsoever. But that does follow the usual communist pattern of adopting fanciful names for their countries that make them sound like wonderful, happy, prosperous places to live in, even if they're really not. Now, the man that the Soviets put in charge of this communist government was the man you see there on the right, Kim Il sung. And he was the founder of the Kim dynasty that continues to rule over North Korea to this day. Kim had been a longtime communist revolutionary and a successful guerrilla leader in the fight against the Japanese. I will just mention, because I've always found it interesting, that there are some theories out there, supported by some evidence but not generally accepted, that Kim was actually an imposter put in place by the Soviets, that the real Kim Il sung, the real successful guerrilla leader, had been killed, and that they replaced him with this man who they had coached up. Again, I've always found that interesting. There's a little bit of evidence to support that, but it's not generally accepted. The other thing that I do want to mention before we move on to the South was that the North was at this time far stronger, particularly economically, than the South. That always surprises people because obviously that situation is completely reversed today. But again, at this time, the North had most of the industry, most of the resources, so it was far better off economically than the South. Moving on to the South, in the American occupation zone, we established an anti communist government known as the Republic of Korea, and which was led by Syngman Rhee, the man you see there on the right. Now, before we go on, I want to emphasize, and I cannot emphasize this enough, Rhee's government was not a democracy. Officially, he was voted into office as the president of the Republic of Korea, but he was pretty much put into power by us, by the United States. It always surprises people, it continues to surprise people when they learn about the Cold War and American foreign policy in general, how often we've put into power or supported in power dictators and autocrats and governments that really don't represent what the United States claims are our most cherished values, particularly in regards to human rights and democracy. It particularly during the Cold War, it was often a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and we, as part of our containment policy, often propped up governments that opposed communism, but were not great governments, particularly towards their people. And this was one of those cases. Syngman Rhee's government was incredibly authoritarian and corrupt. Um, he ordered the massacre of communist sympathizers, several massacres, in fact, that resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 people. Again, very, very authoritarian and corrupt. In fact, South Korea did not become a stable democracy until the late 80s, and we'll talk again about that in a little bit at the end of this presentation. Um, as I had mentioned a little bit in the previous slide, the South was initially far more rural and less economically developed than the North. They had a lot less industrialization, and again, the North was originally kind of the better positioned and stronger economically of the two Koreas. Okay, so on to the start of the war itself. Once these two competing governments had been established in the North and the South, both the US and the Soviet Union ended their occupation and withdrew most of their troops from the Korean peninsula. The Soviets, however, did continue to provide the communist government in the North with significant amounts of weapons. I'm talking guns, tanks, planes, and so on, as well as significant amounts of money. They were pretty much gambling that the United States would not support and defend the South in the event of an invasion from the North. And the Soviets fully expected that the Korean Peninsula would ultimately be reunited under a communist government. As a result, on June 25th, 1950, Kim Il sung ordered a massive surprise invasion of the South. Now, when I say surprise, I mean a surprise. It caught the South Korean forces completely off guard. They were totally unprepared, and as a result, within a matter of days, almost the entirety of South Korea was overrun by North Korean forces. There was a famous incident that I forget the name of the bridge, but when the North Korean forces were advancing on Seoul, Syngman Rhee and his government fled the capital, fled Seoul, and they ordered the destruction of one of the bridges across the river there. Again, I forget the name of the bridge, but they ordered the bridge blown up while thousands of refugees were still fleeing across it. Thousands were killed in the explosion, and thousands more were cut off, prevented from evacuating, and pretty much left to the mercy of the North Korean forces. A famous incident. It really shows the true nature of Syngman Rhee's administration and how authoritarian it really was, and how totally off guard they were caught by this invasion as well. Eventually, and again pretty rapidly, South Korean forces were pushed back to that little region in the southeast corner of the Korean Peninsula that you can see on the map there around the port of Pusan. That became known as the Pusan Perimeter, and again was pretty much the only place that the South Korean forces were able to hold on to initially. This invasion also provided the first real test for the newly formed United Nations. The Security Council met and they recognized the North Korean attack as an invasion of another sovereign country. and they ordered the creation of a multinational force to defend the South. Now, they were able to do this really only because China's seat at the time was not held by the communist government, by the People's Republic of China. It was still held by the Republic of China, the nationalists who had fled to Taiwan. They were still recognized as the legitimate government of China by most of the world, at least most of the non communist world. In protest that China's seat was still held by this now tiny remnant of the former nationalist government, the Soviet Union refused to participate. And it was for that reason that they were unable to veto this resolution creating this multinational force to fight a fellow communist government that they had put in charge. If they had been there, they certainly would have vetoed this resolution, but they weren't. So this multinational army was created. 21 countries ended up sending troops to take part in that multinational force, but I do want to recognize 90% of those troops were American. We were obviously the main force behind this. We were the one with the containment policy. We were the one who had troops there ready to go. So we really took the lead, as was often the case. The UN forces started by reinforcing the Pusan perimeter by stabilizing the situation there. They then quickly launched a devastatingly successful counterattack with a surprise amphibious invasion, a landing near the port city of Incheon, which is on the west coast of the Korean Peninsula on the Yellow Sea, kind of up near the border between the north and the south, which was very, very far from the front line at the Pusan perimeter. It caught the north completely by surprise. Again, as I said, it was devastatingly successful. The UN forces were able to retake Seoul in a matter of weeks and managed to cut off many of the North Korean forces in the south. Uh, Thousands, I think even in the hundreds of thousands, ended up surrendering or being captured by the UN forces. Huge success. They pretty much retook all of South Korea, and the decision was then made to continue on and actually invade the north. That counter invasion of North Korea was initially incredibly successful. If you take a look at that map on the right, everything in blue is the maximum extent of the area occupied by UN forces. And as you can see, they actually managed to take over much of the north. And for a while, it looked like the north would be completely defeated. Unfortunately, as this mostly American UN army approached the river that forms the border between China and Korea, the communist government in China began to get very nervous. Chairman Mao viewed this as a massive threat. He worried that the UN forces would continue on to China once they had overrun North Korea. And he actually ordered a 300,000 strong army known as the People's Volunteer Army to intervene in Korea and to push back the UN forces. And that was something that caught the UN forces completely off guard. President Truman and General Douglas MacArthur had not expected the Chinese to intervene. In fact, they were pretty convinced that they would not. And as a result, the Chinese intervention was initially incredibly successful, and they actually pushed the UN all the way back past the 38th parallel. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they even took Seoul for a while. Um, there was a lot of fighting back and forth in that region, but they pushed the UN forces significantly back, way back into the south. Now, as I briefly mentioned before, the overall commander of the UN forces was General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was a very popular and well known war hero from World War II, and he was also the mastermind behind the Incheon landing that had been so successful earlier on in the war. And once the Chinese intervened and pushed UN forces all the way back beyond the 38th parallel, MacArthur actually started to advocate for the use of nuclear weapons against the Chinese. He drew up a list of 34 targets in North Korea, Manchuria, and even other parts of China that he wanted to drop atomic bombs on. That obviously would have been a massive escalation of the conflict, would have led to a far larger and wider war. And President Truman smartly and rightly refused to allow such an attack. He did not want any sort of escalation on that scale whatsoever. But MacArthur got very angry at Truman's refusal, and he actually started to go to the press, to Congress, and even in some cases to foreign governments to complain about Truman and to try to win over public support and international support for such a plan. As a result of this, going around the usual chain of command and undermining the president, on April 11th, 1951, President Truman actually relieved General MacArthur of all of his commands. He fired him, straight up fired him. A very controversial and stunning decision at the time. Again, MacArthur was an incredibly popular war hero, a very well known general, and kind of the face of this entire war, if you will. Um, and Truman just straight up fires him. In my opinion, probably rightly. Again, he's undermining the president, undermining the chain of command. But it was very controversial, both then and even now. It's still debated whether Truman made the right call, but it is a generally an important event that's cited as reasserting civilian control over the military, something that had kind of slipped up with the military buildup in World War II. The military had become very, very important, and this was an important step in making it clear that the military is still answerable to the president and to the civilian government. Not something you often think about in the United States, but obviously a very important part of our government and really our whole system and way of life. Eventually, the UN forces were able to push the Chinese forces back a little ways, um, and eventually the war kind of reached a stalemate around the original border of the 38th parallel. If you take a look at that map there on the right, they have the 38th parallel marked, and you can also see the eventual border, the kind of uneven line between the blue and the yellow there. Um, Again, it kind of reached a stalemate there. It turned into a war of attrition with both sides really just trying to wear down the other. It did continue on for 2 more years, but eventually on July 27th, 1953, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire, an armistice. That was not a peace treaty. I want to emphasize that. Technically, the two Koreas are still in a state of war with each other. They're still at war. But since 1953, there has been this ceasefire. The actual fighting has ended, but the ceasefire did result in the creation of the Korean Demilitarized Zone. They pretty much left the border exactly where the front was in the end and built the demilitarized zone along that. It is the most heavily defended and fortified border in the entire world, not a place you want to be at all. Um, Constant source and focus of animosity and tension. So I'd like to wrap up just by talking a little bit about the aftermath of the war, particularly about some of the changes that started to occur almost as soon as the fighting itself had stopped. In the South, increased support from the United States and other Western powers uh, really led to some significant reforms. Starting in the early 60s, South Korea really started to industrialize, to move away from that agricultural, rural economy that they had had before the war. There was also a significant increase in foreign trade with those Western powers, and as a result, some really, really significant economic growth. I do want to point out that the South was ruled by a succession of various dictatorships until finally in 1987 they did adopt a democratic constitution, and since then it has been a fairly stable democracy. They do still have some issues with corruption. The previous president of South Korea was actually impeached and sentenced to a pretty significant prison term for some corruption related offenses, I think they were. So it's not a perfect country politically, but it is for the most part a very stable democracy and is now, on the whole, one of the most economically prosperous as well as culturally thriving countries in the world. I mean, everyone's pretty much familiar with K-pop. We have South Korean cars. I can't recall which brands are from South Korea, but I know some of the prominent brands are from South Korea. Um, it's really a thriving, prosperous country with one of the largest economies in the world. The North, on the other hand, fell into that usual communist pattern of collectivization, military buildup, and finally economic stagnation. It continues to be ruled by the Kim dynasty, first Kim Il sung, then Kim Jong il, and now Kim Jong un, and possibly a relative after him. It is increasingly isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. Its only remaining ally is China, and that's really only because they have continued to support them for so long that they don't want to give up on them at this point, and they're worried what would happen to the nuclear weapons that the North does possess in the event that the country collapsed. So China continues to kind of prop them up and support them, but other than that, they're pretty much completely isolated from the world, a failed sort of hermit state, I guess you might call them. Um, and as to the future of the Korean Peninsula, really at this point, who knows where things will go. But I hope now you at least have a understanding and overview of the Korean War. We're going to, on Wednesday, do a little bit more digging into life in the two Koreas, the differences and similarities between them. Um, and then on Friday, we will switch gears again and learn a little bit about the Cold War in Latin America.